Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts.
Hey everybody, we're now accepting applications for our Network Catalyst Accelerator program. Founders in our program have gone on to raise money from Lux, Spark, A16Z, Slow, First Round, SUSE, Homebrew, Mavron, Obvious, NFX, Signalfire, and many more. Learn more and apply at villageglobal.vc/network-catalyst.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, returning guest and longtime friend, Lee Edwards of Root. Lee, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
So the first time we talked, we talked D2C with Nicole Quinn. Last time we talked hard tech with Trey Vassallo. And today we are here to talk about higher education. So before we get into what's happening with higher education in the age of COVID, first, I want to ask, what got you so excited about this topic? Why don't you trace your intellectual journey a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when I was in high school, Olin College was in its first year. They were just starting the college, and the whole value prop, like the thing they sent out to all the students for marketing material was like, help us build this college. We're trying to do things differently. And like that message really resonated with me. I think it's like a kid with, I don't know, like a kind of a mixed background in high school. I tended to like not really like the kind of lecture format of things and the memorization and tests and stuff like that, and kind of did a lot better in classes where I was getting my hands dirty and kind of like actually being a little more self-guided. So I ended up not getting in the first year and then getting into Olin when I reapplied. And it's a college that is constantly kind of like investigating or kind of like prodding itself and trying to figure out how to do things differently, how to improve things, and actually like co-developing courses, especially in those early years. So you kind of can't help but go to Olin and then come out having spent a lot of time thinking about education and like what works and what doesn't, or at least your opinions of those things. So it's just kind of been like an interest of mine since then.
And before you went down this sort of deep rabbit hole of sort of post, COVID, what's happening, pre-COVID, what were your opinions of what needed to change, or what was messed up, or what was working?
Yeah. So like every sentence I say in this, we should like pretend there's a caveat that says like, this is not the opinion of Olin College of Engineering. And I don't even know if they'll be upset that I'm doing this without talking to them. We'll see. But I do think particularly with engineering, and this is kind of even more true like 10, 15, 20 years ago, just a lot of focus on math and science and like fundamentals, which are really useful for certain kinds of applications of engineering. I mean, I think if you're going into like aerospace, there's just a ton of math and physics, and you're typically going to end up with a PhD before you start building, turbines for airplanes. But for a lot of other folks, like people that are writing software, even just like people building consumer hardware stuff or electronics, like honestly, a lot of people are self-taught. I know we all know like very impressive software engineers that went to school for music or philosophy, or didn't go to college. And I actually have even met people like in electrical engineering that never studied that stuff formally, who are really amazing. And so it feels like there's a disconnect there, right? Like, is college really serving people by delaying until they get their hands on things? Like so many mechanical engineering undergrad degrees, you don't get to go into the shop like until near the end. Sometimes because of size, sometimes because of level of risk tolerance. But mostly I think just because the curriculum doesn't mandate it. They're like, no, take a bunch of thermo, take statics, take dynamics, and then, learn how to cut some metal. Like, sure, that's an elective. You're like, really? Are you going to be a mechanical engineer without knowing how to actually fabricate? That's one. And then I guess there's a whole other set of hot takes that are sort of more political around like, well, on one side of the spectrum, I definitely believe in kind of the access and equity in education. Like, we're seeing there are lots and lots of loans and scholarships, need-based scholarships out there that are available, but I still don't think it's enough. It's still clear that we have a very stratified class structure in this country, and part of that is about opportunity and access to education, really at all levels. And then I think the other side of the spectrum, I can buy their argument around groupthink of higher education, often the sort of like ivory tower, walled gardenness of it. And some of the criticisms about tenure, which Olin doesn't have tenure, and that was kind of one of the original precepts.
So that's interesting. What are the trade-offs of not having tenure? Tyler Cowen has long said that we should get rid of tenure. It keeps people lazy or not innovating. Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the original impetus behind tenure is a good one, which is sort of, you think about like the original higher education institutions, they were supposed to be these sort of like ivory tower in a good way, kind of like bastions of knowledge, and trying to make them resistant to the swings in politics. I think, ironically, the idea of professors not being able to be canceled in kind of the 2020 definition of the word canceled. And now we're seeing that kind of reverse. But originally the idea being like, yeah, so you want to study the 1950s in America and you want to study and teach socialist economic theory, you're tenured, you can't really get fired. You can get yelled at constantly, but you can't get fired. And I think that's a good thing. But on the other hand, like the idea behind Olin is it's a very teaching-centric college. And I do think that if you stop caring about teaching, if it's just sort of reviewed and sort of, if there's sort of this objective conclusion that you're not performing as an instructor or as a teacher, there should be ways to sort of do performance reviews and bring in someone else who's sort of better, more passionate, more effective in that environment. So I think, it depends on the institution, I guess, and kind of what their goals are.
Let's get into what's happening now. I'm guessing that because you're on the board of an institution, you're more of an incrementalist than I am when I say, burn it all down. I think sort of COVID is the perfect opportunity for that, because people can't be physically on campus. They're paying a lot of money for an online education that they can elsewhere get for free or much cheaper. And so they're realizing it really is about the credential or about the network, which they can also get in other ways because they're not on campus. And this is hitting colleges' budgets left and right. And so what does that mean, Lee? You've looked at this from a much more nuanced perspective. What's happening?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in the very immediate term, clearly what's happening is campus is being shut down. Folks that I've been talking to at Olin and elsewhere are sort of expecting, or at least preparing for, a semester or two being shut down. It seems like a lot of folks are preparing for that. I think part of that is just colleges are sort of by their nature a little more conservative and risk averse. They kind of have to be, right? They're taking your 18-year-old kids and being responsible for their lives. And, it would be a huge problem, like just in terms of like human life, and also financial liability and brand hit if there were an outbreak at a college. So I expect them to be a little more conservative than most places. So yeah, like inevitably what they're doing is going online. And what's kind of interesting is there are a lot of schools that have been doing online education for a long time. And sometimes their online education is, a lot of them I think is actually quite good. I've taken some Stanford online courses that were actually really awesome and clearly very custom built for the curricula they were teaching. Others are sort of being forced online and having to figure it out. And then others, sort of their online education is kind of like a moneymaker and a second-class citizen within the school. So I think that a lot of colleges are also aware of the fact that not everyone is sort of down for paying higher education level prices for a webinar. And what's really interesting is with that release of online content, and actually Y Combinator has been doing the same thing, where they basically say, our experience is so valuable, the network that you build in person and just the experience of being immersed and being around other people is so valuable that we'll give the content away for free because it's not about the content. And now they're saying, actually, you should pay us $30,000 a year for the content. And so it's kind of an interesting incongruency in my mind. And Olin is in an interesting place where we've sort of always said that the content is novel and the courses we're teaching are not taught anywhere else. And most of them are hard to do online. And there are certain things that, you can't. You can teach calculus online over a webinar. You can probably exit that class and know how to do calculus. It may be less fun for you. But then there's certain things that you can't do online, like machine shop. Or maybe you could send people a drill press and hope they don't get hurt at home. But so I think that everyone that I've talked to in higher education, again, at Olin and elsewhere, is definitely aware of that risk. And they also worry about deferments as a result. If you're graduating high school right now, are you thinking about, should I defer a year, take a gap year, and then come back when classes are on campus again? I think, I don't know what the sort of prevailing outcome is there. For me personally, that probably would have been an attractive option to me. But you're going to see some amount of this, of acceptance deferrals. And so what's going to be kind of weird about that, I talked about in the tweet storm earlier, is like when you're trying to fill a class and a college is accepting a certain number of students, they want a freshman class of, call it 1,000 students, because they know their number of faculty, staff, the size of the dorms, like all the facilities and dining hall, like they have kind of a carrying capacity. And so they basically know their acceptance rate. And they sort of multiply that, the number of offers we give out times acceptance rate, maybe minus some buffer so they can use the wait list. That number is going to be out of whack this year. Nobody knows what it's going to be. And then you're going to end up with a ton of people on a wait list probably. And then next year, what does that number end up being? So there's a lot of like little, and I'm only catching a glimpse of this, right? But I think there's a ton of minutia of college administration that is just being turned on its head right now for something. So many of these schools just kind of operate the same way. There's a lot of just like well-established, well-understood, you can get a degree in college administration kind of processes that are now kind of having to be rethought.
And what's going to happen? Is it just going to be, hey, pause and come back as usual, or are a lot going to go out of business? And what happens with the endowments here? Walk us through a little bit how that works.
Yeah. So one thing that's interesting about endowments, there's been a lot of discussion about this recently, obviously with the PPP and say Harvard getting a $9 million loan from the government, and folks pointing out that their endowment is somewhere around 50 billion, 59 billion maybe. So there's a lot of ways to think about this. I think that a school like Harvard, I would certainly say Yale, a lot of the huge schools have many billions of dollars in endowment, and there's a lot of nuance to that. So one is that's not the money they have to spend. The purpose of an endowment is this college should last forever. So it's invested, there's good investment managers. The person who manages the Yale endowment is one of the best endowment managers of any kind, nonprofit, college, anywhere. His returns are through the roof. And they draw far, far less than that. So a college of that size might draw 1% to 2%, 3% at the most of the endowment, and maybe 75% of the budget is covered by that. A much smaller school may flip that around, and maybe only 25% of the budget is covered by the endowment. But then there's another interesting nuance, which is the endowment is actually multiple endowments. And if you graduate from a college and you gift money to your school, a lot of times folks will put a note on it that's like, this is for the library, or this is, for the museum. Or a large donor might come in and say, I'm dropping $10 million and it's to build a new dorm with my name on it. And those endowments are earmarked and have to stay that way. So there's going to be a weird thing happening where when you see that Harvard is freezing pay increases rather for their staff, a lot of folks are going to look at that and go like, well, the chapel's still open, or like, or the sports team is still operating, or, why is the, schools where that's the primary offering. I'm especially worried about some of the schools surviving. Sure, like maybe the people who didn't want those things to exist are going to get what they want. I think there's huge turmoil and everyone's kind of bracing for that impact right now.
Talk more about how you see, not just post-COVID, a year from now, but 5 years from now, the college landscape really shaping, really evolving. And if you mentioned you don't or can't invest in it right now, but let's say you were doing a dedicated fund solely to focus on the future of higher education, what would be your request for startups, or what's interesting, or where would you be looking?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and again, I should reiterate the hot take. Reiterate the disclaimer that this is my hot take and not representative of Olin. So I think that Olin has done a really good job of how do you make an engineering education much more real world. And the outgoing president of Olin, Rick Miller, just kind of planted a bug in my ear about something that I can't stop thinking about, which is sort of what is that on the liberal arts side. And at first I was like, yeah, okay, that's not that interesting. But then as he started to describe it, there's so many folks that are really interested in like policy and politics and like philosophy and what can we learn from literature and what we learn about human nature through theater and like all these things. And there isn't a ton of like, let's apply that directly to the real world. And maybe that's okay. I mean, I think that higher education for a long time has been, let's learn for the joy of learning. Let's learn to enrich ourselves. And I do believe in that. But I also believe in, hey, we've got, the people with BS degrees trying to solve problems in the world. And again, my hot take, lots of people will be mad at me for this, people with BA degrees telling us we're doing it wrong. And so I love to see, kind of in the vein of that Mark Andreessen essay, and maybe I want to approach it with a little less snark and a little less, I guess, judgment, is why not get these folks in a room, right? So can we solve different problems, like let's say with COVID right in front of us, right? How do we figure out how, when we get out of lockdown and back into the world, and businesses are slowly rolling open, folks that have jobs like ours are going to get to work from home, and as long as we want, and we might stay safe for a very long time. And then there's all these other folks that are going to go out in the city and work with their hands and drive cars and drive trains and like do this critical work. Nurses and doctors and firefighters and police officers, and they're putting themselves in harm's way. Are we going to end up in a situation where the second wave of coronavirus is going to have this massive economic disparity and social, class disparity? It seems pretty obvious that it will. So can folks like that get in a room and kind of think about problems analytically? And I'm not saying that they don't, and certainly this exists in lots of places, but I think it would be fair to say that most colleges are not oriented around doing that with undergraduate students in these disciplines. And certainly not tying them together with engineers. And on the other side, certainly engineers can benefit by spending a lot more time with folks like that. And again, the traditional education model is departments and BAs being different from BSs, and graduate programs being different from undergraduate. So there's this intentional siloing. So yeah, I think that that's a huge opportunity that could have a ton of value for the world. And certainly aligning I think that there's so many different problems with the way liberal art, the folks who are the most in debt from college and not able to reach that earning potential. On the STEM side, often it's much easier to find a high paying job. On, liberal arts style degrees, it can be a lot harder, and it's only getting worse and worse. It's getting more expensive, and the ability to find employment is harder. So we could benefit by a lot more alignment between what does the world need, what does industry need, what does the economy need, and what are we teaching, and how do people get jobs that way. And so certainly on the STEM side, online education, boot camp, stuff like that has done a lot to move more people into STEM. And I think one of the cool things about the boot camp model is it really is aligning the demand of industry with the supply of people that want to do it. There is not as much activity on sort of what's the boot camp for an economics major, what's a boot camp for a philosophy major. That's different from let's just watch webinars online.
Totally. Who's doing something interesting there today? Do you think Lambda is fundamentally disruptive, or who else is fundamentally disruptive today?
Lambda is very, 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 very cool model. I'm also really interested in Minerva schools, which is a little bit closer to a traditional model than Lambda school is. I'm assuming all your listeners know about Lambda school, so I almost kind of glossed over it. But Lambda they would not describe themselves as a boot camp, I imagine, because it is a little more immersive, longer term program. But they're very, very focused on student outcomes, and they're very, very focused on social mobility. Then the big thing that everyone talks about with them is the income share agreement model, which basically makes it so you don't have to have money up front to join the program. You will graduate and then pay it back. And lots of press about that in my opinion has been very unfair, about ways that that could land you in trouble if you're sort of pledging your future income to your college. But I don't know, in my mind as an asset allocator myself, this is a little bit of an argument about the kind of an asset, a debt versus an ISA. The students themselves are very happy with the outcomes. Minerva schools, actually, this is another one where they're going to end up being disrupted, because a big part of Minerva is they're taking students, smaller classes, and they put them in cohorts. And they often will kind of go around the world to different locations, and they study together and build community, and they're working on all kinds of different things. And it really does span everything from machine learning to linguistics, or pure math or philosophy. So I think that they actually have a very interesting approach. They're very new, I'm not 100% sure how old. I want to say less than 10 years. So that's another funny thing about this, right? We talk about the long feedback cycles in venture capital. Talk about a long feedback cycle when you take an 18-year-old through a 4-year program, they're 22, and then you want to track their lifelong outcome. You might have to wait about 80 years before you sort of know, or maybe let's say 40, 50 years till they retire. So yeah, it's always, I think that's one, let's say, design or engineering challenge of trying to build a new educational institution is like, what's your feedback cycle in terms of being tied to outcomes?
Totally. And I'm curious to get your perspective on what we're doing at On Deck. So On Deck is sort of a, for the audience who may not know, is a sort of Stanford MBA for founders, or trying to be like that. This year we're going to have 1,000 people who've paid us, around $1,000. So we'll be sort of $1 million a year. And people are having a great experience so far. It's mostly people who either haven't left their company or just started to leave their company, and over time will move to sort of an ISA model. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how far we could sort of take this idea, Stanford MBA for founders, maybe it's also for undergraduates who say, hey, I don't want to go to Duke or whatever, pay $250,000 to be to eventually be an entrepreneur. I'd rather pay 100x that or 10x less that, and use the rest of the money to invest in a business, in my business. Like, what would you be doing if you were On Deck, or what questions would you be asking?
Yeah. Well, I think I didn't even mention that in the previous answer, but I think disrupting the MBA, there's like some clear opportunity there. Almost even just redefining the MBA as what it originally was and has gotten away from would be interesting, which originally the MBA was explicitly, let's turn engineers into people that can run businesses. It has gotten away from that. And there are a lot of programs that, that is still their goal, but a lot of MBA programs are fantastic at turning people into executives, right? Like you look at a professional CEO that comes in and runs a multi-billion-dollar brand company or something. They always have an MBA, or almost always. But you look at founders, and MBA programs have not done a great job of even, let's say, startup founders, and certainly startup founders that eventually do grow and become the founding CEO post-IPO of these billion-dollar companies. So yeah, I mean, clearly there's an opportunity for teaching people how to start a business that's not tens of thousands of dollars and almost explicitly about building network and signaling. That's more tactical and more, let's say, I mean, it could still be about building relationships, but a little more relevant to what you're doing, I suppose. And I think one thing that you guys are certainly providing that is super valuable for anyone trying to get into startups in any capacity as a founder or an employee or whatever is just sort of getting that network, right? I think that folks, I've known you for a little while, Erik. I know that like part of what you're trying to do with your life in general is to sort of lower those barriers and try to make people more accessible to each other. I think it's like one of the more rewarding things about venture capital is that you're kind of incentivized and you're given the space and time and ability to just sort of connect people, go, oh, you're working on this. You're working on this. You guys should talk. Or you two, sorry, apologies. You two should talk. We kind of get made fun of for that sometimes, like, oh, you're just, a silly connector. But there is value in trying to reduce the exclusivity of networks and trying to kind of democratize them. I think to the extent that you can build a community online in this way, and how that's going to get easier and easier, I think both in terms of us getting used to having online communities and in terms of tools for building online communities improving, there's just so much more, like in my mind, social good to providing access to starting companies to people all over the country, all over the world, decentralizing Silicon Valley, so to speak.
Yeah, it's not a place, it's a mindset. If college is a bundle, some combination of education, network, and credentials, online education has somewhat unbundled the education part of it, combined with sort of accountability. Network, things like YC, hopefully On Deck, are starting to get at that, although, Stanford or Harvard are still great places to go for there. And I think the last remaining part is that we haven't really got started on as much is the credential. And I think that's hard to get at. How do you think about the future of credential? And of course, there's sort of, vertical based, there are dev boot camps, sales boot camps, growth boot camps, et cetera, for specific skill based credentialing, but there isn't sort of like as broad and legible, but also legible credentialing of, hey, this is a really impressive, well-rounded person who, went through a bunch of hoops and succeeded, and Bain or McKinsey can trust that, or whoever, Google, at scale. Maybe that's a false sort of premise, in that we don't need to recreate that broad credential, and it's just all sort of micro or vertical-based, skill-based credentials. How do you think about the future of credentialing?
Yeah. I mean, I think to talk, I guess, all around the issue from different sides, like, I do think there is some utility to credentialing in some sense, right? Just kind of the idea of like, okay, you took these classes, you probably know these things. Let's interview further and find out more. There's certain areas where, like, I suppose a hospital wouldn't really be super interested in interviewing someone for a medical doctor role if they haven't gotten a degree. Regardless of how regulations around licenses and stuff worked, I think that would still be the case. But on the other hand, like, I think it's started to become exposed a little bit that higher education credentials are sometimes just signifiers of sort of where you come from, and not necessarily what you've sort of been through and what you've learned. And certainly I think that's one reason it's kind of amazing to see how big that story got around the fraud around SAT scores. It's just like one of the biggest stories of the last few years. And really that's all it was about, was sort of cheating on credentials. But it did, I think, really kind of pull the veil back and start making people think. From an employer's perspective side, like, I think certainly having been like CTO at startups and hiring managers at startups and even like smaller public tech companies, it's always a lazy way out to try to look at the credential. And I think when you kind of do unconscious bias training as part of a hiring process, one element you often talk about is like being aware of how you might bias yourself. When you see that Harvard logo on the resume, you might find yourself giving them the benefit of the doubt in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. But honestly, it's kind of just a lazy way to hire people. Like, some of the best people I've hired didn't go to school, or went to a school that I hadn't heard of, or maybe didn't have a great reputation. And forcing people to look a little more closely at the individual and to have just a good hiring process, have good interview questions that actually serve you finding the people that are a good fit for your company. It may have less to do with how quickly can you implement merge sort in C++, and more about, are you going to be someone who's going to be successful at this company long term? And those two things might have minimal overlap. So yeah, I do expect to some extent there's going to be a lot more skepticism of traditional credentialism from higher education. And it's probably a good thing, as long as it doesn't go too far to the point that we're having people build airplanes that, learned everything they know about aerospace from playing Kerbal Space Program. But I don't expect that'll happen.
Totally. And let's talk more about the endowment for a second. What does this mean for LP capital? Because endowments, of course, are some of the biggest. What does this mean there?
Yeah, in terms of endowments investing in venture. So, a few things. So I think college endowments are usually invested pretty conservatively, because it is going to be much more about wealth preservation than growth. Like, you can plan, if you take a look at your endowment, if you could just choose for it to stay static and say just grow, just track the market, that's the investment strategy many schools, probably most, are doing. So it's a good thing, because a lot of schools have been hedged really well and have lost less value than the S&P 500. Certainly they've lost some value. So I think you see a few effects. One is you'll see a lot of stuff now about how, hey, during a downturn is a great time to invest in venture capital. And so I think you'll see a lot of more sophisticated LPs choosing that as an investment strategy. But I don't think colleges are going to sort of say, now's the time to add more risk. In fact, what might happen is, if you imagine the portfolio, the endowment itself has lost 10% of its value. And that's, things marked to public, like things that are held in the public markets. If you think about what percentage of the endowment their venture capital portfolio now represents, if it had moved from 3%, if it was at 3% and it's designed to be at 3%, maybe it's moved to 4 or 5%, just because venture capital portfolio marks are slower to change. And so what you might see is a lot of endowments saying like, wow, we're over indexed on venture now. So we don't necessarily want to get into a new fund. Or maybe in the worst case, they're going to say, hey, we actually aren't going to be in fund 5 of this fund that we've been in for 4 funds. But I think what you won't see is college endowments refusing the capital call. So I'm concerned about that for certain venture funds, like smaller seed stage funds, maybe, or first time funds that are driven by, you see the rise of micro funds lately a lot, the last couple of years. I guess I would predict a little bit of a downturn in those. It seems that if you've raised a micro fund and most of your LPs are, say, like your friends in for 50 grand at a time or something, they might say, hey, times are tough. My partner lost their job. I might want out of the fund. You're not going to see any colleges doing that because they're long-term, and every college wants to live forever, so they don't want to damage their reputation in venture. So I don't think you'll see it go that far.
A lot of complaints about the higher education system has been around debt and the inability to pay that off. But it's been hard to compete because it's or inability, you can't even forgive those loans. But it's been hard to compete because you can't compete with the government in some sense, and that's why in some sense I think also ISAs have been hard. Talk a little bit about financing, how debt works for student loans, how student loans work, and whether we should be excited about ISAs or other alternatives.
Yeah. Well, I think clearly you can look at all these graphs. They all say the same thing, that the cost of college is just going up and up and up. And it used to be the case that getting a great job was much easier by having a college degree. And to some extent, it almost didn't matter what it was in, just sort of having that stamp of approval. Weirdly, I think it's definitely been a trend over hundreds of years of higher education that higher education is getting more and more accessible. And again, certainly it is not perfect or anywhere near perfect, but it's a world of difference away from, say, when Harvard was founded and it was a place for the elite of the elite to study, religious related education. And what you've seen is kind of more and more people being in it has simply just made the supply of people with bachelor's degrees go up and up. It's no longer a guarantee for a job. I think that's kind of like no secret. So then it becomes very difficult to pay off the loans that you've made. And it's the one loan you can't declare bankruptcy and get out of. So student debt is pretty insane. Although I think I was looking this up recently, I think about 1 million Americans have defaulted on their student debt. That's obviously especially tough now. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think that there's going to be a little bit more skepticism around should I take out a big loan and go get a degree in something that isn't going to pay me money? Certainly if you're wealthy, that's the idea of just going to college to learn and have a great experience and meet people, maybe meet your lifelong friends and partners. That's great. You need to be in the financial position to do that because you're not going to be able to just sort of repay it in the way that you maybe could have 50 years ago. So yeah, I don't know. To some extent, that's a bubble. I'm also really partial to this argument called the cost disease, which again, I guess is not really universally accepted. And I'm also not an econ PhD, so who cares what my opinion is? But the argument essentially is that there's no solution to this problem because the cost disease argument essentially says there are lots and lots of things in our world that technology and scale have made cheaper on sort of a per unit basis. There's a lot of negative things people say about global agriculture, industrialized farming. One thing that it's good at is lowering prices because of the massive scale and the technology that's gone in, and maybe at some cost to, say, local farming or food quality, some people might argue. But in any case, as lots and lots of things get cheaper and cheaper for people, globalization making hardware cheaper, right? Your flat screen television costs you $100. The wallet share that services that cannot scale goes up. So getting a massage, getting a manicure, going to college, seeing a doctor, anything that scales linearly with people is essentially increasing in value, increasing in cost as a percentage of your wallet share. So yeah, so I don't know. I'm pretty doom and gloom about the state of this. Something's got to change. And I think so many things with COVID, it may not be that COVID is the reason and that this changes, but it may just sort of accelerate it. I think if someone ends up paying $30,000 to get a bunch of webinars about and a reading list of Shakespeare, they're going to wonder, like, couldn't I have gone to the library and done a reading group with my friends? Like, I don't know. I mean, certainly my grandmother was a Shakespeare scholar, so I shouldn't knock this too hard. There's a lot of value, especially in something like that, to talking to people that are real experts. But is it worth $30,000? I don't know. Maybe if you're rich already.
So speaking of, you had a line in your tweet storm about the non-technical disciplines. The world needs ethics, history, policy, liberal arts, but the way they're taught, the enrollment sizes are out of whack with the size and nature of demand. 0 colleges are innovating on this, and few to no startups. What can be done here?
Yeah, I was trying to allude to that earlier. I mean, I think that, well, here's a specific, I'm like completely stealing this from a single conversation I had. So I have to credit him. So Rick Miller, who's the outgoing president of Mullen College, I don't know how many other people he's talked to about this, but he's been kind of thinking about what's he doing now that he's retiring as president. And one thing he's been thinking about is, what if let's take ethics. What if you studied ethics and you do all the typical ethics curricula, right? You're learning all the different schools of ethical thought throughout the many centuries that it's been studied, but you're also building like a portfolio approach, in a sense, where maybe you find a real problem that you want to try to apply ethical thinking to, and you're probably going to have to work with people from other disciplines to actually make an impact. So let's say, like, I don't know, access to water in sub-Saharan Africa. So you may have to work with civil engineers and all kinds of stuff. So you build this portfolio of like project application of what you're doing, and do this like 12 times. In the same way that someone who's like studying computer science may end up graduating with a bunch of projects that they can show, or someone that's studying graphic design can graduate with a design portfolio. Isn't that going to be more attractive to the market? Would a civil engineering firm be more likely to try to hire you because they can look and go, oh, wow, like you've actually made a ton of impact in these different areas? So it is kind of like applying an engineer's mindset to liberal arts education. And so a lot of people will just, I think, be allergic to that idea. But I'm also just really partial to the idea that there's so many different ways to learn, and letting people choose what way they want to learn. Some people can learn, the classic thing, right, is auditory, visual, manual, whatever. My mom is actually a special education teacher that teaches kids how to read, particularly older ones who've been illiterate for a long time. And there's a very specific technique that works really well. It doesn't work for anyone else. Like it would be a waste of your time. But different problems having different styles that are good at solving them, and different people being attracted to different styles of education. I think that this random idea that I've literally thought about for 3 days, it'd be super interesting to see someone actually try that and see if that actually worked better for certain kinds of people, certain kinds of learners, and if the market were more appreciative of it.
Why did college itself get so expensive? You were talking about cost of disease earlier, but specifically, why did they spend so much money on the facilities and stuff like that? Like all these amenities that silly now in COVID, but even before COVID seemed silly. Like, is that really what students wanted? Or were they really listening to their customers there? Like, why?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think that certainly this is not the thing that explains the whole trend, but sometimes when you see a ridiculous building on a campus, it's the thing I mentioned earlier, where some alum is like, I really want my name to be on that college campus for the rest of time, so I'm going to build a dorm. And like, this is a classic thing when you talk to college administrators, they're like, oh my God, this person wants to donate so much money, we can't say no, but it is the most useless thing. And we could not convince them to put the money into the general pool for unrestricted funds because of their essentially ego. That's not going to be like the number one cause, but it certainly doesn't help things. Yeah, I think that cost disease is definitely a huge part of it. I think just the willingness to pay, right? The idea that if you're of a certain social class, you kind of need to go to a certain kind of school to meet other people that are also of your social class. That is not something that was invented recently. And, that's, to a large extent, what certain colleges have always existed to do. Those folks are going to be price insensitive. And I think I guess I just keep coming back to various forms of the cost disease. If there are also just more and more people wanting to go to school, as traditionally it had been something that opened a lot of doors for you, and it still does open a lot of doors for you. But then it's just harder and harder to scale to college, especially if they want to keep what they perceive as their quality bar.
The cynical take that I've heard is that colleges are really a tax sheltered hedge fund, and that the school itself is really a sort of subsidy for the main business, which is the endowment business. And that Harvard, when I said to Naval, it was like Harvard would actually be better off, going to 400 students instead of 7,000, like shrinking it way more, giving quality way up, and just tripling down on the endowment. How do you respond to that critique? And I guess more broadly, should governments should they have tax sheltering, and should governments be sort of like financially supporting these institutions?
Yeah, I had a tweet a while back where I was like, higher education is basically it's an endowment. Actually, I named the school. I was like, this particular school is essentially an endowment that happens to use its management fee, or it's a VC. Is a hedge fund, happens to use its management fee to train its future LPs. So it's kind of, I had a good friend who was in academia reply like, no, stop. It's kind of unfair because, it's not like people they tend to not be for profit. Although on the other hand, certainly the top paid college administrators and certainly the endowment managers make millions of dollars. But the endowment manager of, again, the best performing endowment at Yale could make way more money on Wall Street, especially given his track record. But still, they make millions of dollars. So I think maybe there's some truth to that snark. Should government pay more for college? Like, absolutely. I mean, I think we're so underinvested in education at all levels, all over our society. It's shameful. One of my good friends, Laurie Voss, who was the founder CTO of NPM, he's from Trinidad, and he tweeted a video the other day. The president of Trinidad and Tobago, or prime minister maybe, but the talked about and threw a little bit of shade at Donald Trump, but talked about how the islands were ready, and he has been listening exclusively to doctors and scientists, and he said this is the culmination of us investing in our own people, investing in our education. We have experts here, and God, gave me chills even just repeating it. It's like, why are we not doing this? I mean, obviously we do invest some in education all over, but I would say not nearly enough. Certainly to the point that I would think even more so with K through 12. Why are teachers paid so little? Especially now, everyone who has kids, I'm not someone with kids, but everyone who has kids that I know is like, oh my God, this is terrible. I love my kids, but I can't spend this much time with them. I'm like, yeah, go thank your third grade teacher when school opens up. This is what my mom does for a living. And, and God, she makes, not as much as a software engineer, which is kind of ridiculous. So, yeah, certainly I think I guess I would go so far as to say it's a disgrace how little we prioritize education relative to how important it is.
Yeah, and I think there's the more nuanced specific question of how much should government be supporting incumbents versus encouraging upstarts. And I believe in the case against education, they were saying that they should get. Brian Kaplan was saying they should get out the business of of these sort of interest-free loans, or just the way that they do the loans. I wasn't sure exactly of the argument. To the extent that you're aware of it, what are your thoughts there? Or because more broadly, favoring incumbents versus favoring upstarts?
Yeah. There's there's certainly an interesting economic argument, obviously, about if you're providing interest-free loans, what are you sort of doing to the economy at large, and sort of having the government underwrite these things. That's, I guess I would say I'm not quite a deep thinker on that issue, but so in terms of favoring upstarts and large institutions, yeah, it's interesting. I guess in a perfect world with a lot of capital behind this problem, you might kind of want to do both. I think one thing, again, there's so few sort of startups in education, so I have to kind of keep coming back to Olin. But one thing Olin talks about a lot is kind of the difference between the college and the mission. So on one hand, we're always wanting to innovate and we're always trying new things. On the other hand, kids are going there to get an education. So if you kind of figure out this interesting way to teach thermodynamics. And then you go, cool, we've taught this, like we've figured out this really cool thing. And now the professor that came up with that is on to their next experiment. And Erik, wait, we built that thermodynamics class for what reason? Like, shouldn't we all be taking it now? So you kind of do need an investment in both. So I think there's, like some of the public universities that I really respect. I'm from Florida. I think, University of Florida has done a fantastic job with research and with educating tens of thousands of people with all kinds of backgrounds. Again, not quite good enough, but getting there. City College of New York, which is where actually Olin's incoming president is coming from. Like, one thing that's really impressed me about the CUNY and SUNY systems is, so here's an example. When you were talking earlier about acceptance rates and sizes of school, like those schools have very high acceptance rates, and they think that's a good thing. And I think it's a good thing. They're trying to provide opportunity to people. It's a very community focused college. It's all about folks that live in Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and what are the other ones? And Staten Island and the Bronx, that they want to provide access to the community. So yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a good case for both. I think that some people might argue that the government's not super great at startup style ideas, kind of disruptive innovation, or at least certainly they haven't been recently. So at the moment, I mean, I guess I would say that a lot of the innovation, I think probably most people would agree, like a lot of the innovation that you're seeing that's really deep, like first principles thinking innovation in education, is happening in the private sector. That's, certainly, if you look at the people that started in online learning really early and have done a great job, lots of private schools. If you look at Lambda School and what you're doing at On Deck, and, certainly Olin, Minerva, think about like the Claremont colleges have done a really great job of building kind of a new consortium model, new in the sense of college, meaning less than 100 years old. Cooper Union, all private.
Sorry about that. My guest today has been Lee Edwards of Root. Lee, for people who want to learn more, where might you point them? Obviously, follow you on Twitter, and anything else you want to plug?
Oh, yeah. So I should say that. Yeah, so Root Ventures is a seed stage firm. We're focused on what we call hard tech. So there's 4 of us. We're all engineers, and we're all still, very much practicing, at least as hobbyists. So I focus in what I call hard software. So I'm looking at AI, ML, developer tools, anything that's difficult to build in software. Chrissy used to run, she ran big parts of hardware at Square and at Apple on the Apple Watch, and iPod Touch, iPod Nano. So she does a lot of electrical engineering, consumer products, supply chain. Kane does a lot of industrial automation, old industry. He's sort of walking howstuffworks.com. So we're interested in all kinds of that stuff, and never too early. We talk to folks like before they've quit their previous jobs and they're thinking about new startups. So Lee at root.vc. So yeah, we're doing pre-seed, seed, post-seed, say like $1 million checks on average, but certainly higher or lower, as we're all trying to figure out this crazy new environment. What was the last part there? Said, oh yes. Yeah. So at Terron K, TERRONK, and my blog is lee.af.
Awesome. Lee, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been another great episode.
Thanks so much.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.